Hello. So we've been trying to do this poem now for a few weeks, but here it goes. On first looking into Chapman's Homer. Much have I travelled in the realms of gold, and many goodly states and kingdoms seen. Round many western islands have I been, which bards in fealty to Apollo hold. Oft of one wide expanse had I been told, that deep-browed Homer ruled as his domain. Yet did I never breathe its pure serene till I heard Chapman speak out loud and bold. Then felt I like some watcher of the skies when a new planet swims into his ken, or like stout Cortez when with eagle eyes he stared at the Pacific, and all his men looked at each other with a wild surmise, silent upon a peak in Darien. This is a poem about reading poetry. Uh, I think we wanted to do this poem because we read poetry. We're trying to do a weekly thing. That's the ideal. And so this is Keats talking about what it is for him to read poetry. In fact, there's a kind of story that goes along with this poem that Keats had read actually Chapman's Homer with a friend, and they read it out loud to each other all night. And Keats was so excited about this that he didn't want that experience to end. And so even after his friend left, he wrote down this poem, recording the experience of what it felt like to read it, and sent it in a letter. He sent the sonnet in a letter to his friend. And so in this poem, we have recorded Keats's idea, or some of Keats's ideas, on what it means to read poetry and what that feels like. So, the geographical metaphor, which he kind of begins with, talks about poetry as discovery, which I think it's one of the kind of ways we think about poetry today as traveling discovery. I read a poem, I go to a different world, I have a different perspective on it. But if you take this idea seriously, it's a very different idea than this other idea of poetry that we have of like poetry as like an aesthetic object or something that it does delight him in a way, but like much more than that, it actually opens up a new world. So this is like the reason why Keats has cherished his reading of Chapman is because of this discovery of a new world.
Yeah, I think it's really important to point out, as you did, that this poem seems to emerge from or try to give voice to an experience. I think maybe describing its structure might help us delve into just like sort of how this experience happens. So in the sort of first part of the poem, we get this, journeying scene. So he's a person who's traveling through the realms of literature. And then in like right smack in the middle of the poem, we have a shift. So he said, I never breathed the pure serene of Homer till I heard Chapman speak out loud and bold. And then I felt. And then he gives us two different descriptions of how he felt. So with the first description, like you said, he gives voice to this experience of discovery. So he feels like some watcher of the skies when a new planet swims into his ken. So what can we make of this image?
Well, when a watcher of the skies, when a stargazer sees a new planet, it's something exhilarating, and it's something also very disorienting. You think you know what all planets and like celestial bodies there are, and then there's a new planet. It completely changes your picture of what the world is. Now, we can sometimes think of poetry as consolation, that like you read poetry to like make you feel good, etc. But like here, this is testifying to an experience of reading that actually doesn't console as much as it announces that the world is very different than what you have thought. That is a very radical thing. That to read a poem is to be unsettled in your interpretation of the world, to have that interpretation loosened, to open yourself to like new ways of like perceiving. Uh, so, what's the second metaphor?
So the second image, I think, is quite interesting, not only because of its slightly problematic associations with the colonial project and sort of the European discoveries of the Americas, but also, so here we have Cortez. He sees the Pacific for the first time. And then embedded within this image is another one. So in between the dashes, all his men looked at each other with a wild surmise, who have presumably, witnessed this sort of like world-making experience, and they look at each other.
Okay, so like he revises it. Like it's almost like one way of reading the second simile is that like he said the first one, and it's right, but then there's something that's left out of it, and so he has to say or and then do the second one. And what's specifically left out of the first one is other people. And I mean, he read this with a friend, and it's almost like stargazing is such a solitary experience. I mean, there's something very special about having a discovery, but then knowing that someone else is also having it. Like to discover the world together.
I mean, we understand poetry a lot of the times a representation of an extremely private experience in language. But then there's the fact that it's in language. So poetry is one of those things that's both private and public at the same time.
Right. I mean, and that's like that's some way like the miracle of it. The fact that these thoughts that we think are so difficult to express because they are so solitary and we can't find the words for them. When we find them expressed in language, this thing that's external and available to others, there's a joy in connection, I think. You feel a sense of community in a way that I don't think many other experiences kind of parallel. But like another thing that's like very fascinating is that there's a certain belatedness in this discovery in terms of human history, and yet it's the first time that Cortez is discovering it. But that actually corresponds precisely to like Keats' own relationship to Homer, in the sense that, I mean, Homer is old news. Like everyone's told Keats about it. He's been around for millennia, and yet Keats is discovering it for himself for the first time, and it's still this very fresh thing. And I mean, I think this also says something a lot about poetry. Like, why are we reading poems that are written like hundreds of years ago? And yet, they're perpetually something that can yield a new perspective.
Right. We have to believe that poems remain relevant. And we have to believe that the act of reading them is sort of an ever necessary act.
I mean, poems, in a way, are repositories of ideas. You say we have to believe that poems are relevant. I mean, in a sense, we already do. That's something that needs to be explained in a way. Like, why is it like that you can read a poem that was written like 700 years ago and feel like it's talking about your life? I mean, it would be, I think, unwise to explain this fact away by like resorting to cliches about like the immortal themes of poetry. That's actually like a bizarre thing. Like, I mean, Keats says that he knows that Homer has been around, but it's important for him to read Homer himself. I think it's true that every generation needs its own readers of poetry. Uh, I mean, this is why the humanities are not like the sciences in a way. Like you, and in fact, this is why the discovery model is like also weirdly discordant. That's why it's important that Cortez is like belated.
Well, so I think you're right. Like every generation needs its readers. Um, but this is a poem called "On First Looking into Chapman's Homer." So the role of Chapman here, also as call him like a steward of poetry or something, sort of that link which makes the old knowledge sort of still relevant, and we need Chapmans also in order to continue keeping the work of poetry relevant. And speaking of like this belatedness, like I wonder if there's room in this poem, like to think about the fact that obviously there were native knowledges there as well. But so poetry becomes, I guess, a continual work of translation.
This poem helps articulate why it is that I think we started this series of poems think at the time that we did. Uh, I think that Keats shares our experience of reading poetry, which is one of disorientation. It's not something that stupefies us, that fills the world with pretty pictures, that makes us insensitive to it. It rather is something that does quite the opposite. It unsettles us. It opens up new possibilities of looking at the world and therefore acting in it. Um, People talk a lot about changing the world through action, which is something that really needs to be done. I really believe that's why uh, thinking in radically new ways, and therefore poems, can be an important part of changing the world.
Something that comes along with this sort of like idea of a new interpretation of the world is a new like imaginative faculty, like it's a new willingness to think otherwise in the first place. Yeah, so let's read the poem again. On first looking into Chapman's Homer. Much have I travelled in the realms of gold, and many goodly states and kingdoms seen. Round many western islands I have been, with which bards in fealty to Apollo hold. Oft of one wide expanse had I been told, that deep-browed Homer ruled as his domain. Yet did I never breathe its pure serene, till I heard Chapman speak out loud and bold. Then felt I like some watcher of the skies, when a new planet swims into his ken. Or like stout Cortez, when with eagle eyes he stared at the Pacific, and all his men looked at each other with a wild surmise, silent upon a peak in Darien.